We're going to pick up our discussion here with the column base of Antoninus Pius. The apotheosis and Curcio are the two sides that show there's actually four sides as it's a column base. If you can tell on the left and the right of the image, two of the sides of the column base are identical. The one side that's facing us, this is the apotheosis. The other two sides that are the same are the Curcio, and then opposite the apotheosis, there's an inscription on the column base to Antoninus Pius. But this is a commemorative form of architecture, as the Romans like to do for propaganda. They do those kinds of commemorations way more often than the Greeks. Antoninus Pius was the successor of Hadrian, and remember, Hadrian is the one that we talked about with the Pantheon. These two sons of Antoninus Pius are the ones who commissioned this work upon his death, and these two sons were meant to be co-emperors and both succeed Antoninus Pius here. When we look at this side of the column base, there are so many things that say to us classicism. First of all, we've got some classical personifications, and that's not an idea that we've talked about a lot in our class, but to use a human figure to stand in for a group of people or for an idea, this would be a personification. You could also call it a classical allegorical figure. And that's what we are seeing used here. They use those in ancient Greece. So it's something that ties Antoninus Pius back to the Greeks. And of course, we all remember the propagandistic meanings of that. It shows that the Romans are as sophisticated and cultured, as educated and intellectual, and as militarily as powerful as the Greeks who came before them. So we have a couple of classical personifications on this. On the bottom left, the figure reclining, that is a personification of the Campus Martius, and that's where the funeral pyre of Antoninus Pius was, its location in ancient Rome. On the bottom right, we have a classical personification of the people of Rome itself. And we've got a figure here who has, the accoutrements of war and domination, and is shown to be a very powerful type of figure. In the central location, the winged figure is the classical figure of Eternitas, and on his back is Antoninus Pius and his wife. And essentially what's happening here is that after the death of Antoninus Pius, they are being apotheosized or deified, and Eternitas is taking Antoninus Pius and his wife right up to heaven where they will become gods. So many classical elements here in terms of the figures and the personifications. But if we go beyond that, there's also classical elements in the style. And I'm sure you can spot the classical approach to the human form. It's idealized, it's anatomically correct, it's proportionate, it's posed believably. The kinds of things that we associate with classical Greece. We also have classical looking drapery, again, a Greek element. All of those things are Greek in their style as well. We have a nude figure, which is something we usually associate with Greek style in addition to that. And we also have the classical calm on the faces of these figures. So all of those are ways to tie Antoninus Pius and his Roman successors back to the glory of Greece. So it's propaganda in many ways. Now, look at how classical this is here. And then look at this image here. So this is the Curcio side, or one of the Curcio sides rather. You can see on the right the figure of the Campus Martius that we just looked at on the apotheosis side, reclining away. Now, when you first look at this image, ask yourself, if you were to see this image and to see the image of the apotheosis on the other side, would you ever think that they belong to the same monument? They're very different in appearance, very different in style. And what we're seeing as we move towards the late Imperial period is that the outlying areas of the Roman Empire are becoming more and more powerful as time goes on. Rome itself is sometimes even less powerful than it had been in the past. We're getting to a time period also when politics are really going to kind of become unstable, and it will be especially intense when we get to the late imperial period. Lots of political tumult, quick turnovers of power, but we're getting close to that point already here with Antoninus Pius. We're towards the end of the Pax Romana and towards the beginning of the instability. And as those outlying areas become more influential, there's more of an interest in catering some of these monuments of propaganda to the tastes of those outlying areas. So on the fringes of the Roman Empire, some of these are places that would never have seen a Greek classical work of art before. They don't have a knowledge of the Greek classical tradition. They don't have a preference for the Greek classical tradition, and most often their own artistic indigenous styles and approaches were non-classical. Right? And if we're using that term classical, it essentially means what we'd expect with Greek classical art: believable, ideal, anatomically correct. And if we're saying non-classical, we're saying non-ideal, not anatomically correct, not spatially convincing. And when we look at this rendering of the Curcio, all of those non-classical adjectives are the ones that fit. If we look at the figures in comparison to the horses, the proportions are off. If we look at the figures by themselves, we have a stockier build, a stockier kind of approach to the human form. It's a little bit less ideal. It's a little bit less naturalistic. We have a rendering of space that's very unclassical, and what we are seeing is it's as though we're standing, and we have a side view of the figures. We see all of them as though we're standing across from them, but if that were really true, they'd have to be lying down on the ground to have this effect, or the horses would need to be unicorns and flying in the air, and we can tell that that's not the case. So really, it's a kind of interesting combination in the way they're portraying space. Instead of following all of the rules that we'd really have to make a naturalist depiction of the side view. Instead, we have a kind of a combination of that side view in with like a bird's eye perspective, as though we're up in the sky. And it's not a very believable approach to space. We don't feel like it's very convincing. And all of this is a great indication of that non-classical style that's becoming, at this point, a part of the Roman Imperial tradition in art and architecture. This commission here is actually the first to use a non-classical style. So we're seeing it used in conjunction with the classical style together, but it's a great reminder of how Romans welcome those outsiders in, let them keep a lot of their ideals and cultural traditions, but still integrate them into the Roman Empire and give them a part of the Roman identity. Now, the subject matter that we're seeing here is a funeral procession ritual. They encircle the funeral pyre, and you can see the horses kind of riding around that central area. We're not actually seeing the funeral pyre itself, but we are definitely seeing non-classical style, inaccurate proportions, inaccurate representation in the sense of space, a sense of chaos rather than a sense of order and rationality that we'd expect with classicism. Here's a detail so you can see these guys close up. Okay, so we're moving into, on the slide list, the time period of the late Imperial period. We're going to skip over the portrait of Caracalla, and I'm not going to actually even give very much background on Caracalla himself as we discuss these baths, so that the group that's presenting will be fully open-minded, I guess, so I don't steal any of their thunder as they come to prepare next time. These baths of Caracalla, we're looking here at a reconstruction of the baths, but remember that so many Roman leaders wanted to convince that large, multicultural, multilingual empire of their generosity, of their strength, of their successful leadership. And one of the ways that they often did that was by financing public works. We talked about forum, we talked about basilicae, we talked about aqueducts, we talked about commemorative forms of architecture, like we saw just with our last example. We talked about the baths, we talked about theaters and circuses and all of these things that the Roman emperors would build for their people as a way to placate them, as a way to gain their favor, as a way to show their talent as an oversight manager, to show their talent and wealth, their power, all of those kinds of ideas, all wrapped up into these structures that were built. This one here, you can see, was built in a pretty short amount of time, 211 to 217 CE. Now, it was actually begun by Caracalla's dad, but it was finished up by Caracalla. And when they look at the scope of these baths, they are huge. The complex covers 33 acres. You could have up to 1,800 bathers at a time. And of all of the Roman baths that were documented in the 4th century, which is just a little bit after this is built, and there were over 900 of them documented, this was the second largest. So a huge scale here. And of course, that scale says something about the cost, says something about Caracalla, his wealth and his power and prestige. So because it is so large, there's an incredible amount of material. And based on the fact that we know the dates here of the construction on this work, we think, or we know rather, that there was about 2,000 tons of materials that were installed each day by an estimated 21,000 workers. So really a massive project, huge in size, huge in scope, and the ability of Caracalla to finance and oversee such a project. This was all propaganda for him. And of course, he's wanting to give it to the people for their use, for their health, and of course, to gain their favor. This reconstruction here gives you kind of an idea of the layout on the whole. Let's look a little bit more at some details about the baths. Here are the remains today. It would have had a very plain exterior in the Roman tradition of architecture, but then the interior would have had many open and vast interior spaces. And remember, we said that was something that set the Greeks apart from the Romans, that the Romans would create these really large interior spaces. If we look at the floor plan here, you can see the progression of rooms. There are different types of baths in the complex itself. The number 1 section here, the natatio, that was a pool that was 54 meters by 23 meters. The frigidarium, the next one down, that was roughly 59 by 24 meters. And this had a large vaulted ceiling above it. 108 feet was the apex of that vault. The Calderum, if you go down to number 4, that was about 35 meters in diameter, and it had huge 12-meter tall granite columns surrounding it, each of them weighing 100 tons. So all of these spaces are really large, open interior spaces. And not only does the size say something about Caracalla and propagandize him, but these baths were known for being incredibly luxurious and really opulently decorated. This is a reconstruction based on some finds. This is actually quite an old rendition from about the turn of the 20th century. But we know that the baths of Caracalla had numerous statues decorating the grounds, had incredible amounts of mosaic in the ceiling and on the floors, and that the walls were faced with marble revetments. It's kind of like a veneer, really beautiful and luxurious kinds of stone to make them look appealing and fantastic. There were other rooms besides the swimming pool rooms, I guess, but they were cafeterias, reading rooms, massage rooms, places for music, places for working out, gardens, museums, all sorts of things here at the baths. So the baths were really an important social center for Roman people. Would have been a wonderful gift from the emperor on their behalf. Here is a copy of the Farnese Hercules. This copy was in the baths of Caracalla, just to give you kind of an idea of some of the sculpture that would have, and also to give you an idea of some of the mosaics. This is a remnant of the floor mosaics. Romans do a lot of these pebble mosaics, and they would have been really beautiful and made for a very luxurious interior. Okay, this is the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus. It's not an example on your list. I do just want to kind of point out to you that the style is becoming increasingly less classical as time goes on. You can see how compressed the space is here. You can see that the body proportions are slightly off, although I would say this isn't as bad as the proportions on the Apotheosis and De Curcio of Antoninus Pius, or rather only on the De Curcio. But we have a real sense of chaos and horror vacui here, which are incredibly non-classical. The emotional faces and the sense of compression here, all of that would be things that we would say are non-classical elements. And at the same time, you can see a few classical things still hanging on. The drapery, for instance, is nicely captured and pretty convincing. The attention to the musculature and trying to make that look ideal even when the proportions aren't completely correct. That too is very classical. So that coexistence of styles that we saw with the Apotheosis and De Curcio of Antoninus Pius, that continues on throughout the late Imperial period, and we can see that here. Just on a side note, this is a sarcophagus, and the trends in Rome, even before Christianity takes off in the 3rd century, were increasingly to be buried rather than cremated. So coffins or sarcophagi become more popular. Here's a little detail for you to take a look. They're supposed to all work in harmony to rule the empire on the whole from their different sections. But unfortunately, really in the end, the tetrarchy is not very successful. It's very short-lived. And though things settle down initially, quickly things kind of disintegrate once again. And that's actually going to lead us into Constantine and his power. But when we're looking at this image here, it's an incredible statement as to how the style has transitioned, because rather than using a very Greek and very classical looking style for the propaganda and the message that they want to send out here, instead we are using a blatantly unclassical type of style. There are a few things here, if you're looking at the figures themselves, that clearly say we've left classicism behind. One of the first things, I think that's one of the most obvious things, is the rendition of the human form. We have very little detail and our attention to anatomy. The proportions, of course, are completely off. There's not even really a convincing sense that there are bodies underneath the drapery. Instead, everything seems very cylindrical. Doesn't seem to have the form and the detail we'd expect from the human figure. When we look at the faces, they are very generic and they're repetitive. And in fact, we really don't have any differences from one figure to the next, in not only in their faces, but also in their dress, except that we have the two beards. Here's a figure with beards right here on the second in from the right, moving towards the left. The beards are there on the figures to mark the Augusti, the Caesari are beardless. But other than that, these are identical figures. The pairs are identical in the way that they embrace each other. There's no differentiation from one figure to another. And not only is that non-classical, but it really does tie in with the propagandistic purpose for this work. This is based on the idea of concordia, which was a very popular idea in the literature of the time and also in the political circles of the time. And essentially the idea is harmony and accord and agreement. And this message was obviously one that was meant to attempt to help stabilize the political system and a way to support the tetrarchy. And this message was so important, it was more important than the naturalistic appearance of the work, and instead they have used something that's a more abstracted approach to the human body. And historically, this is true that when artists want to focus on a message from works, that they usually spend less attention to making things look believable and naturalistic and spend more attention on ways that they can spread the message more effectively. Okay, so after the time of the Tetrarchy, which, as we said, was not successful, we begin to see Constantine rise to power. Diocletian actually abdicates from the Tetrarchy, and there's conflict that ensues after that amongst the remaining members of the Tetrarchy, Licinius, Maxentius, and Constantine. There's a lot of fighting between the two. There's a lot of between the three. There's a lot of backstabbing between the three. And eventually what happens is this culminates with the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Constantine is going to meet Maxentius there, and he's going to emerge victorious from that. And there's a really important story that goes along with this, because before he goes to battle, sources are a little bit unclear. He either has a dream or a vision. There's not really a big demarcation between the two. And in this, he sees the Chi Rho up in the heavens, which are the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. It was a symbol that was associated with Christianity. And he hears a voice essentially saying, "By this sign you shall conquer." So they paint the Chi Rho on the shields of the soldiers of Constantine. They go to battle at Milvian Bridge, and they emerge victorious. And Constantine attributes much of his success to the Christian God. And the next year, in 313, he legalizes Christianity. And though he's not baptized until 337 himself, this really is a turning point for Christianity. Now, of course, by this point in history, Christianity has been around for centuries, but those early Christians had been persecuted in Rome. We're looking at a mosaic. It's from Egypt, and it's from the 3rd century. And there are moments in Christianity's history where the persecution is heavier than at other times. And in the 3rd century, there really was intense persecution. Remember, we talked about how Christians refused to participate in imperial rites and religious rituals that were meant to ensure the success of the Roman Empire. But the Romans also have a distaste for Christians based on their beliefs and based on their class. So when we're looking here at the slide, you can see redemption for all. That was a real hard idea for many Romans to swallow, especially the upper class Romans to swallow, because it seemed to suggest that all people were of equal worth, right? When the Christians taught that everyone had the capabilities to be saved, it put everyone on an equal playing ground, and that was hard for upper class Romans to take. Christians also had a God that came in a mortal body, right? Jesus Christ was crucified and passed away, and though he's later resurrected, this mortal body that he had initially was something that the Romans thought was really kind of unusual. So there are a couple of beliefs there that Romans had problems with when it came to Christianity. But for the most part, The early converts to Christianity were from the poorer classes, and Rome was an incredibly classed society. Those upper class figures that had a lot of political power had disdain for the lower classes, and so when many Christians were poor, that wasn't necessarily a benefit or a plus for the way that Christianity was seen in the eyes of many Romans additionally. So they don't like their beliefs for redemption for all, for God and a mortal body. Romans don't like Christian classes and backgrounds because many of them were poor. And they don't like the fact that the Christians refused to participate in these different religious rites and ceremonies that Romans felt were necessary for Roman success. So, for all of these reasons, the early Christians were pretty persecuted. They faced a lot of problems, including even death extremely, but arrest or seizure of property. These are different things that would have happened to some of the early Christians. Once Constantine, however, legalizes Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313, things began to turn around rapidly. And we have a great number of Christian converts right there in those first few years, so much so that by 325, Constantine has called the Council of Nicaea. And he's called together leading Christian rulers, or I guess, I'm sorry, not rulers, but leaders. And he's brought them together so that they can discuss the different kind of flavors of Christianity that were around in the Roman Empire, because Constantine wants to unify all of those beliefs. He wants to homogenize all of those beliefs into a specific set of beliefs that everyone can share that identifies themselves as Christian. And the Council of Nicaea is meant to do that. And once we have that in 325 AD, there is an incredibly rapid decline in paganism, and Christianity really takes off. Now, Christians, as part of the lower classes in Rome, were really drawn to kind of a non-classical style. But because of their religious beliefs, they were even more interested in a non-classical style. And we'll talk more about that when we get to our discussion of early Christianity. But just kind of know that because of their religious beliefs and because of their background as coming from the poorer classes, a less classical style was usually what appealed to them. So when we're talking about the transition of style in the late Imperial period, there's a couple of things coming into play explaining why we have less classicism. The first would just be those outward fringe areas of the empire that were getting more powerful, that did not have that classical tradition or the preference for Greek classicism, sometimes weren't even aware of Greek classicism. That's one reason why we start to see less classicism cropping up in artworks. But by the time we get to the legalization of Christianity and the growth of Christianity, that preference for a non-classical approach just solidifies because of the Christian social classes, coming from, the majority of them coming from poor classes initially, makes them more drawn to a less classical style. And then for their religious beliefs, they are also interested in kind of turning away from classical approaches and methods. So we're heading down that track. We've got another reason here contributing to the non-classical approach that's in the Roman late Imperial period. And there's a whole test question on why Romans began to use that less classical approach. And you'd want to explain those reasons that we're talking about. You'd probably want to give just a little bit of background on what we mean by a more non-classical style, kind of define that as part of your answer. So remember, in the late Imperial period, political change was really intense. When we talked about Caracalla before, we didn't talk about the quick change of power that happens both before and after him, and that's just something that continues up until the time we get to the Tetrarchy. And by the time we get to the Tetrarchy, that turnover of power is happening even more rapidly. And so emperors are really, really interested in trying to appeal to any and all Romans, the lower classes, those out there on the borders of the Roman Empire. All of them are important audiences for the propagandistic messages they want to send through art and architecture. And this is some of the reasons why we're seeing more of that non-classical style become prominent. If you look down here, you can see how it was sitting down here in what's called an exedra. The semicircular area here is an exedra. And that statue of Constantine was meant to just send out the message to those in the basilica that Constantine is the ultimate seat of power in the Roman Empire and that he's overlooking all of the proceedings within the basilica. Of course, the size of this project, the scope of the project, the amount of materials and costs associated with the project, the oversight and workforce management associated with the project, all of these things would be propaganda for Constantine. And of course, he is very interested in propaganda, having just come out of that turmoil surrounding the Tetrarchy, trying to institute himself as this new Christian-friendly ruler. He really needs all the propaganda he can get. Okay, so when you come to class next time, we'll pick up with this Arch of Constantine, and we'll kind of just slightly review the content of what we have here. But I hope that this helped answer any questions you have on the late Imperial period and helped you finish filling out your worksheet. And we'll see you at next class.